Hello, friends. Registration for next year's Exiles in Babylon conference is now open, and I cannot wait for this conference. Here are some topics we're going to wrestle with: the future of the church, disability in the church, multi-ethnic perspectives on American Christianity, and a dialogical debate on the problem of evil and suffering. We're still finalizing some of our speakers, but so far we've got Matt Chandler, Eugene Cho, Greg Boyd. He's going to be engaging in the dialogical debate on the problem of evil with Clay Jones from Talbot School of Theology. We've got Lamar Hardwick and Devin Stahl talking about disability. Michelle Sanchez from the ECC is going to be talking about the future of the church. Anna Ross is going to give her perspective on a Native American perspective on American Christianity. And of course, we've got Ellie Bonilla and Street Hymns backed by popular demand, along with Tanika Wyatt and Evan Wickham, who will be leading our multi-ethnic worship service again. And I can't believe there's another and we're going to have a pre-conference, a scholarly conversation about women in ministry featuring, Lynn Cohick, Scott McKnight, a couple other complementarian scholars who they're going to be dialoguing with. And I'm currently solidifying the details on that, so stay tuned. So March 23rd to 25th, 2023 here in Boise, Idaho. We sold out last year, so we'll probably sell out next year as well. So register sooner than later if you plan on coming. You can always attend virtually if you can't make it in person. All the info is at theologyintheraw.com. That's theologyintheraw.com. Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. My guest today is Dr. Abigail Favale. Dr. Favale is a writer and professor in the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame, where she just recently got hired. She has written for The Atlantic, First Things, Church Life. She's written, her first book is Into the Deep, an Unlikely Catholic Conversion. And her most recent book, which was just recently published this July, is The Genesis of Gender, a Christian Theory. And that's the launching point for our conversation. We talk about her expertise in the concept of gender. We also talk about her journey into and out of third wave feminism. And we go into a lot of details about what that even means, what's the difference between first, second, and third wave feminism, and why she used to buy into some of that and then now no longer does. And we also talk about her conversion to the Catholic Church. So please welcome back to the show for the second time, the one and only Dr. Abigail Favale. There's two kind of big topics I want to talk about. First of all, you just released your book. Is this your first book or first popular level book?
It's my second popular level. I have an academic book that was like my dissertation, which shall not be named. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, but I'm not going to plug that right now. I did write a memoir about my conversion to Catholicism in 2018. Okay. So that was my first kind of popular book. And then this is my second.
So this book, The Genesis of Gender, a Christian Theory, which the last podcast we did, we talked all about gender, and I really enjoyed that conversation. I did want to hear about in more detail your why you left feminism, and that's not even the right way of framing it, because it's like what kind of feminism are we even talking about?
Sure.
But I kind of want to do both. But let's start with your book. Give us an elevator pitch of what your book is all about, and I'm sure I'll have several questions at the end of your elevator pitch.
Right. So the title is The Genesis of Gender. And there's sort of a double meaning there, because the first part of the book covers the genesis of the concept of gender. So it traces a more or less linear narrative of how the concept of gender developed over the 20th century, because it entered the scene in the 1950s through the work of psychologist John Money. Mm-hmm. And then it kind of made it's kind of morphed, right? It morphed went in through second wave feminism and then third wave feminism. And then now it's kind of become gender identity theory. So it's, I kind of trace that story and go in depth, but also hopefully in a way that's accessible to people. Because I think one of the confusing things about talking about gender right now is that people are using the same word and meaning wildly different things by it. Right. Yes. But they're having this conversation and talking completely past each other. So I try to at least trace the source of that confusion, why there are so many different definitions that people use without maybe even realizing it. And some of them are even contradictory. Anyway, that's the first meaning of the genesis of gender. And so that gives rise to what I call the gender paradigm. Okay. And I use that term rather than gender ideology for a few reasons. One, I think gender ideology is is not a really helpful term because it's pretty divisive. But also I think the gender paradigm, I use the word paradigm because it refers to this entire way of seeing thing. And so I think once you kind of buy into this way of understanding the human person without realizing it, maybe you also kind of buy into a certain understanding of reality and God and truth and all that kind of stuff. So it's this way of seeing. So I describe how the gender paradigm arises, but then I compare it to what I call the Genesis paradigm or the Christian paradigm. And then I kind of do a worldview comparison between those two, also discussing some of the contemporary things we're seeing with gender, and making the case for a Genesis understanding of gender.
Oh, the book of Genesis, or?
The book of Genesis. That's the Christian theory, right? So I'm kind of basically making the argument that, look, if, to be a Christian is to enter into a particular way of seeing, and that informs everything, even our bodies and sexual difference, and that in a Christian understanding, all of that is tied together. So it's not just this kind of side issue or this tangential issue, but how we understand the relationship between the soul and body. I mean, that touches on how we understand the incarnation, the resurrection, the Eucharist, right? So there's so much theological truth at stake in how we understand the human person.
I want to just go a little bit deeper into the development of the concept from John Money to today. How would you summarize? So is John Money, he was like the main one that started to talk about gender as something different from biological sex. Is that kind of correct?
Yeah, well, he was the first. Yeah. Well, so he was the first one to use the term gender, right? So he kind of borrowed the term gender from linguistics, because prior to the 1950s, it was a linguistic term that meant category or genre, right? Genre, gender. You might have heard the feminine gender, but it wasn't just attached to that idea. It was mainly referred to forms in language, right? You've got, like in Spanish, you have masculine, feminine endings to words, right? So that would have been the words gender. Okay. But then John Money took that linguistic term and began to apply it to people. And he was the first one to do that. But in my book, I start the story a little bit before John Money with Simone de Beauvoir, because in her book, The Second Sex, even though she doesn't use the term gender, she names the concept that the word gender will soon become attached to, right? And this idea, this famous line from The Second Sex, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman.
Right.
So in that statement, she's kind of denaturalizing the idea of woman, and she's making a distinction between woman and female.
Right.
And then so John Money's work kind of develops that distinction, and he uses the term gender. So he has this idea of a gender role. There's this socially constructed identity or role that has no intrinsic connection to sex, but then becomes fixed after the first 2 or 3 years or something through a process of socialization. So that was his theory. And I'm sure you know the story, right? The kind of harrowing story of the Reimer twins and his horrific experimentations on them, and how they both committed suicide. Anyway, so there's this tragedy that plays out from, say, the 1960s, when he begins to treat this pair of identical twins, one of whom has his genitalia destroyed in a botched circumcision. And so he says, wow, this is a great opportunity to test my theory. I've got a control right here. I've got like twin boys, right? So one will enculturate as a boy, and the other we will enculturate as a girl, and it'll all be fine. And then so he treated them throughout their childhood, and eventually the boy, the gender identity of a girl, found out the truth. He rejected that identity, and he ended up killing himself. Actually, both boys ended up killing themselves. But by the time that happened, that was in the early 2000s. So in the interim, from the 60s to 2002, 2004, you have this concept of gender completely taking hold, especially through feminist theory and in the humanities and social sciences. So his theories about about this idea of gender, this gender identity that's totally separate from sex, ended up being, proved wrong by his controlled experiment of these twin boys, but it was too late. By then the idea had already taken hold. So anyway, then I talk about how the concept develops through second wave feminism, and then third wave feminism with Judith Butler. It takes another turn. Yeah.
I knew, so yeah, just to be, so he had this idea that gender, let me use the phrase like masculinity, femininity, like, or gender role, even like this boy who, 6 months old or 8 months old or something, they basically did surgeries to make him into a girl because he lost his penis through the surgery or through the botched circumcision. So if we just raise this person as a female, then, and they wouldn't even know any different, then we can kind of like, because the assumption is that gender expression is culturally constructed, therefore it all work out. And it didn't. Like he very much had a more masculine identity that was felt suppressed. And then, is that a accurate way of kind of repeating what you said in my own terms, just to make sure I understand? Okay. And then did that, I mean, it didn't really come out till, I feel like it was, as I read the literature, it was really popular when it seemed to be working. Oh yeah. And then it came out that he found out what happened, went through depression, committed suicide. His brother did too. That seems to be, I don't want to say buried. Like if you Google it, you can, the wiki article, it's there, but it's almost like his concept of gender just still kind of took off. And even though the experiment kind of failed, it. Right. Yeah, because so in the 60s and 70s, he's publishing on this concept of gender. And then second wave feminists take his terminology of gender as a way to develop the classic sex gender split in feminist theory, which is the idea that sex refers to biology and gender refers to the social norms and expressions of sex in a particular culture. Right. And so that allowed feminist theorists to sort of critique gender norms while also affirming that yes, sex is real, but that doesn't mean that women have to have long hair and dresses, for example, right? Like that's not something that naturally happens. Right. That's a social norm or expression or custom. Can you quickly? So Can you quickly define and summarize first, second, and third wave feminism for people that maybe not know those categories? Yeah. Yeah. So first wave feminism refers to the movement that grew out of the abolition movement and was really focused on getting women the right to vote in the early 20th century. The suffragettes, cast off the shackles of yesterday. Yeah. So that's first wave feminism. You can keep going if you want. You can finish the line. I could. I totally could. Oh, yeah. Shoulder to shoulder into the fray. Anyway, so after the 1920s, when women got the right to vote, at least in the United States, feminism kind of went dormant as a movement, right? So that was really focused on legal equality, first wave. And then in the late 1960s, early 1970s, you get the second wave of feminism. And this, even though Simone de Beauvoir kind of happened between, or she wrote The Second Sex between the first two waves, she greatly influenced Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique, an American woman. And that book really sparked the second wave. And so the second wave of feminism went beyond just legal equality to analyze or to kind of reject more social equality. And Marxist theory was much more influential at this time. And so instead of just accepting the terms of the liberal state and wanting legal access within that, instead they began to interrogate the system itself, right? Okay. That this is patriarchal and taking kind of a Marxist analysis and thinking of women as a class, almost like the proletariat that's oppressed by the bourgeoisie. You have the class of women that's a patriarchy. And it's during the second wave that the sexual revolution is also kind of taking hold. And so the sexual revolution and second wave feminism kind of form a bit of an alliance. And while, for example, first wave feminism was not pro-abortion or even pro-contraception, by the second wave, feminism and becomes really allied with the pro-abortion and pro-contraception movements, which at least the abortion movement prior to the second wave was very much a male-dominated movement. It was led by men. Oh, really? Yeah. Okay. Huh. Yeah. So it wasn't until they kind of wooed the National Organization for Women in the 60s, which was pretty controversial. There were plenty of second wave feminists who really thought, no, this isn't a good solution for women. Anyway, but NARAL, the National Abortion Rights
something something was founded by men and mainly run by men until they formed an alliance with now in the second wave feminism. So then third wave feminism is really influenced by postmodern theory and postmodern philosophy. So in third wave feminism, you get, we're talking here like the late 80s and 90s. Judith Butler, for example, I think is one of the key figures there. And so when we're talking about sex and gender, she draws on, say, Michel Foucault to say that not only is gender a social construct, but sex itself is a construct, because any claims of knowledge or reality or truth that we make are ultimately exercises of power. And you also get in third wave feminism more of a sense of, sex positive feminism. So you have these interfeminist wars in the late 80s, the sex wars, the feminist sex wars, where you have the second wave feminists, mainly second wave radical feminists, who are anti-pornography, anti-prostitution.
Right.
And then you have the third wave sex positive feminists who are like, no, sex work can be liberating, porn can be liberating. Let's really lean into the sexual liberation ethos, because that's where freedom is found. Anyway, so that's kind of the first, second, third wave.
Okay. Is there a fourth wave? I've heard people talk about a fourth wave, or is that not really a thing yet? I mean, honestly,
the wave metaphor kind of breaks down after the second wave, because the first and second wave makes sense because there's literally decades, 2 world wars between them, or one world between them. There really was this interim where there was not much going on at all. But after the second wave, feminism is always around. It just kind of takes these different shapes and forms, right? So fourth wave, I think if I were to define fourth wave feminism, I would say that once you get the advent of social media and the Me Too movement, you kind of see a different form of fourth wave feminism. So I would say fourth wave feminists actually are a little more skeptical of sex positive feminism, a little more likely to maybe say that there are kinds of technically consensual sex that can still be bad for women. So you definitely see that perspective in the Me Too movement, right? So, and a greater focus on intersectionality. So the ways that different kinds of oppression intersect. So
it is. I mean, well, I got so many thoughts and questions. But this is why I don't like the term feminism as a whole. It's like, what kind? Like, if someone asked me, "Are you a feminist?" I'd say, "Well, which wave are you talking about?" Like, any Christian should be a first wave feminist, right? Like, that's just basic equality, right? Would you say, are there some like more less than Christian?
Yeah, well, it's also complicated because even within the waves, because you're thinking waves are almost like historical snapshots of feminism. Even within a particular historical snapshot, you have different, even in second wave, you've got like the radical lesbian separatist feminists, and you've got the like Marxist feminists, and you've got the, the feminists who are still kind of like trying to make friends with political liberalism, so you still have a variety there. One thing that I think is helpful to realize is that feminism as such doesn't really have a lot of philosophical content to it. It tends to borrow that from other philosophical systems. Like feminism, a particular kind of feminism tends to be grafted on another kind of philosophy. So that's why first wave feminism, it really takes the like liberalism, the idea of, individual rights, autonomy, and equality, that takes those values and that kind of understanding of society and the human being for granted, and then looks to have women find equality within that system. And then you've got Marxist feminism, so feminism that kind of takes more a Marxist worldview for granted, or again, postmodernism. So I think that's where it gets really complex, because the feminism tends to be kind of the flowers maybe, but like what's at the root? Like that's where you have to figure out like, okay, what kind of worldview is being taken for granted here?
So you were knee deep, I mean, in feminism. Which wave were you? Were you more of the third wave or second wave or?
Yeah, I would say I was a postmodern feminist. Yeah. So I was really influenced by French feminism of the 80s and 90s. I think I kind of absorbed the sort of sex positive perspective of feminism as well. So yeah, I would say I was a third waver.
Am I missing something when when women say pornography is liberating for women? Like that just seems like the most, like, you don't believe that. You can't, right? Or am I missing? Is it lesbian porn that they're talking about? Or I mean, it just seems so demeaning to, and I keep hearing it's getting more violent and just more almost. I heard one person describe it as like very rapey, almost like how.
Yeah.
But if you were a third way, like, did you actually believe that at one point, or is it kind of like you have to say that because your environment is? I don't know. Like, I just can't imagine somebody actually believing that.
Right.
But
let me see if I can get back into that headspace for a second, because I agree with you, right? Like I'm so like, man.
Like I follow a few, like, I guess they would be second wave modern feminists. And yeah, they're very like, no, porn is not liberating. Like they're very like adamant, like main talking.
And
point.
I think that's much more of a feminist perspective that's being articulated now than it was when I was in my feminist heyday. I think that would have, in fact, actually, this reminds me, in my dissertation, one of the texts I analyzed, it's called, the novel was called Original Bliss by this Scottish writer, and it's about pornography. Like it takes a critique of pornography, and it's a really fascinating novel. I kind of see it as almost this like sort of rewriting of Adam and Eve's story, but it's weird. But anyway, one of the male characters, has this like debilitating violent porn addiction that he eventually kind of comes out of. And so I analyzed that as, so even though I'm saying like I was kind of a sex positive feminist, I still was critical of that kind of violent pornography.
Okay.
But at my defense, when I was defending my thesis, I had to defend the fact that chapter was critical of pornography. And because one of the examiners was like, well, porn, I mean, this seems to be, a little bit, conservative and, kind of regressive, and that it's saying that porn can be bad, and I was like, so I actually had to defend that position because it was a little, not the feminist norm, I think.
Yeah.
So basically, I think the idea is that it's like the moral framework of sex positive third wave feminism is consent, right? So if you consent to something, then it's liberating, right? And there's not much nuance there. So
power differentials within consent don't really matter. I mean, as long as it's consent, I mean, that's.
I mean, I think I think you would get some analysis there, but say for example, the idea that a woman could, a woman who decides to do sex work, that can be a way of her claiming agency and ownership over her body. And, it's just very much this sense of autonomy, freedom, and consent. Like that's kind of, if you're not hurting anybody and you're agreeing to it, then yay, it's awesome. Right. So there isn't really a sense that you can consent to something that's harmful, or that harms you whether or not you agree to do it. So I remember when I was a few years ago, when I was teaching a gender theory class, and I had some students who were coming from this perspective. And they argued against me like, porn's awesome. If it's like, woman-centered porn that's made by women and for women, kind of, it could be great or whatever. But I asked them like, okay, well, what about they were pushing this consent thing. And so I asked them, well, what about a woman who consents to be physically abused? Like, is that good? And they were like, you kind of see the gears like sticking a little bit, because it was like, wait, yes, but no, it can't be, right? So I think that I write about this in the Genesis of Gender, this perspective, and how consent is not enough. Like, yes, it's important, but it should be the starting point of the sexual ethics, not the ending point.
Yeah.
Because it's not enough to just say the best that we can hope from sex is that it's not rape. I think we can do better than that. So yeah.
Well, it seems a little sociologically naive to just talk about consent as if it's by the way, my audience doesn't know this, but I got these Invisalign things on my teeth. They're like retainers.
Nice.
So it's like this plastic. So I feel like I'm talking with a list the whole time, and sometimes I can't pronounce things. Anyway, nobody needed to know that. But if I do fumble my words, I'm not drinking. I'm not drinking yet. No. Where was I going? Oh, like just the concept of consent, like, yeah, but what are we talking about? Like, okay, so take porn. Like a woman is, had a horrible upbringing, has been abused by men, has been down and out, becomes an alcoholic, and now needs the money, can't hold a job, and male domination has created this horrific environment that has led her to have to make a consenting decision to become a porn star and sign up to be dominated. And one might even say, I don't want to say, let's not even say abused, but let's just say dominated by men, in whatever way they want. And she is agreeing to that. That's consent. To be a porn star, unless you're like trafficked into it, is consent. But really, how is that not promoting just the, male domination on such a horrific level? Like, just the word consent to me just seems so empty now. It's like, well, that's a starting point, but like, let's talk about power differences. Let's talk about environments that lead to certain unhealthy forms of consent or whatever, or even manipulation. I mean,
exactly. Yeah.
I had a friend who was it was a young teen, and he was coaxed into a consenting sexual relationship with it was same-sex sexual relationship with his older, I think, cousin or something, and he says it wasn't like I did not enjoy it. I was confused, and he was dominating all this stuff, but like, I wouldn't say it wasn't consensual, but there was power differences there that were off the chart unhealthy, and messed me up for life, so I don't know. Yeah. People that celebrate consent, are they asking, is this like a discussion, or is it kind of like, oh, I haven't thought about that? Or,
well, I do think that the conversation has evolved more in the direction that you're describing, especially post Me Too, right? Because that was that was really the conversation there. And I think younger feminists are more skeptical of, the liberation of hookup culture and all that kind of thing. So like Emba, she just wrote the book called Rethinking Sex, which is a critique of the sexual revolution, but you should get her on here. She would be great.
What's her name?
Christine Emba, EMBA. She is a writer for the Washington Post. So you're beginning to see critiques of the sexual revolution, but from leftist feminist perspectives, not just Christian feminists.
Yeah. Interesting. I listened to Megan Murphy, been following her stuff, and she's one who would be kind of a classic second wave feminist and would really protest all the stuff we're talking about. Like, I think she's the one who even said, like, I don't know if it was her actually, but like Harvey Weinstein's, the casting couch, she says that's a form of consent, and if a woman, in one sense, a woman says, yeah, I want this job, so I'm going to go to the casting couch. It's like, but you can't, there may be some kind of consent there, but the whole power dynamic, the whole situation is just a hot mess, right? I mean, so you're saying more and more people are kind of questioning the consent only kind of model.
Yeah, but I mean, I think you have to have some sort of sense of an objective good for human beings, like, maybe an objective sense of human flourishing, because I think that's what the sex positive perspective is lacking, because there is no objective good. Like, the good is simply doing what you want in the world, like kind of exercising your agency in the world and doing what you want and having this unfettered freedom, this self-determination, right? But if you have a sense of, if you're coming from a perspective that, well, no, human beings have a particular kind of nature that's made for certain things. And so it's living in a way that we're allowed to achieve those good ends that we're made for. That's what freedom is. And that a society that is ethical should be one in which human beings are allowed to achieve those particular ends, not just whatever ends they decide to achieve. So that seems to be, I think, a big distinction there. Like, what does freedom mean? Does freedom mean achieving the ends for which we're made, or does freedom just mean, achieving whatever ends we pursue?
That's a great distinction. Achieving the ends for that sounds very Catholic, right? You guys are good at natural law stuff.
Yeah, it's probably a little Catholic-y.
I see some incense, burning behind.
Yes.
I actually got some incense for my room. My kids love it because I'm in my basement and I'll burn incense and it goes through the floorboards and like they'll come down, and sometimes I literally listen to Gregorian chants sometimes when I'm studying. So now I turn on the lamps, turn the lights off, burn my incense, have the chants going, and that's man, awesome. If that doesn't convert you, I don't know what will. But
I don't know, man, slippery slope.
What you kind of touched on it, but just I would love to touch into your narrative a little bit. So what really drew you into this third wave feminism, and then I would love to hear what was your journey kind of out of that way of thinking.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I grew up an evangelical Protestant, and when I went to college, I think from a young age I was already interested in questions of gender. I think I was coming from a religious background that had not that much to say about what a woman should be or do beyond be submissive and assist a man. Find a man to help. Right. There wasn't a lot of I didn't grow up in a tradition where women preached. I never heard a sermon on a woman in the Bible growing up, so it was, I think that question was already alive. And I went to college, and then I discovered feminism for the first time. And I thought, this is what I've been looking for. This is amazing.
What college?
And I think
what college was that?
I went to George Fox University as an undergrad. Okay. And I had a feminist Bible professor and a feminist philosophy professor, and that's and so at first I was really interested in feminism, and I would say though at first I approached it still from an evangelical perspective. So I very much took God seriously. I thought he existed, and I thought that Jesus is our savior. The Bible is authoritative. The Bible is divine revelation. It just needs to be interpreted correctly, right? So my first kind of feminist phase was just doing a lot of hermeneutical stuff. Like, let's look at these tricky passages that seem to say women can't teach or preach, and let's look at the Greek words, and let's look at the cultural context, right? So it was very much that kind of work as an evangelical egalitarian feminist.
Okay.
But then the more I immersed myself in feminist theory, feminist philosophy, feminist biblical interpretation, the more over time I adopted what's called a hermeneutic suspicion.
Okay.
So aside from, I would say, egalitarian evangelical feminists, most even Christian feminists would really be probably adopting a suspicious posture toward the Bible, kind of seeing the Bible as this human, man-made, specifically man-made text that is patriarchal and has this intrinsic patriarchal bias that we always have to be resisting. And I think I eventually adopted that perspective, and I began to see the Bible as just that. This is a human artifact, essentially a patriarchal artifact. And I think if you're coming from an evangelical perspective and then you completely just like neuter the authority of the Bible, then, you don't really have any clear way, like authority that you're standing on, right? So I think without that foundation, then I easily entered into a much more postmodern sensibility, both as a Christian and as a feminist. So this, by postmodern, I mean this idea that everything is a social and linguistic construction, including religion. But, Christianity is beautiful. It's this beautiful story, this beautiful narrative, and I still find meaning in it. But there's also this patriarchal stuff. So we need to kind of save Christianity from itself, right? We need to salvage and purify Christianity from its sexism. And then that's when I went to graduate school, and my dissertation focused on analyzing women novelists who were rewriting religious concepts in their fiction. And then I was using feminist theory to do that. Right. Okay. So, and during this time in my life, I dissertated, but I didn't like practice Christianity at all. Like I thought about Christianity a lot, but only as this sort of idea or thing to pick and choose, what to believe. So I didn't pray. I didn't go to church. I certainly didn't read the Bible. I think I was in a phase where I just really hated the Bible, I think probably. And so I was there for a while in that spot, but still considering myself a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had this kind of cognitive dissonance, I think, where there wasn't a lot of content to my Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't like beholden to anyone. That's what I see now when I look back. There was no authority higher than myself to which I was beholden, right? So that kind of Christianity can't offer any real conversion, right? Because it's all on my own steam, you know? And I don't know, I was like a 24-year-old, like, I'm only a 38-year-old now. Like you can't, I've only been on the world for like a second. But I was ready to sort of look at this 2,000-year-old tradition and be like, oh, you guys are so wrong. I need to fix you. Let me fix you, Anyway, so fast forward, toward the end of my 20s, it's so weird to tell this story because it doesn't really make sense. But basically I had these intersecting crises. So I had this spiritual crisis because the kind of Christianity that I had adopted, like I just said, can't offer any real conversion. Like I had reduced God to an idea that I was analyzing, So I did not worship him. I didn't pray to him. I had really closed myself off from his grace, from him being able to work in my life. Of course, he was still working behind the scenes, all the time. Yeah. And I also became a mother for the first time. And that really rocked my world. That kind of disrupted some of my, I think, just really easy feminist assumptions about things like abortion, for example. Actually seeing an ultrasound of my 12-week-old baby who was like sucking his thumb and, doing circles like in the first trimester. I was like, oh, this is not what I was told. That's not a clump of cells. Like that's a human. That's a human being. And anyway, so I think feminism had really become my religion. It was the way that I really viewed the world. And that experience of motherhood disrupted it enough. And that coincided with a spiritual crisis that I just kind of panicked and became Catholic.
Oh, really?
I mean, it's crazy. Like, it's a crazy story.
You panicked and became. So what was it about the Catholic Church that was the safe place to run to in your panic attack?
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't imagine that it would be, right? It's like, okay, you're talking about the patriarchy, like all those like men in their red hats running the world or whatever. So, yeah, well, I think I had been drawn to Catholicism for a while. Okay. So as an undergrad, I also became Anglican. Okay. And that was my first exposure to the sacraments, to the saints, to that kind of Eucharistic worship. And I found that really meaningful. But then I kind of went on my little, postmodern trek that disconnected me from that. And I think I was honestly at the point where I was like, I either need to be honest with myself that I'm pretty much an atheist in practice, or I actually need to get serious about this Christian thing if I'm going to still call myself a Christian. Okay. So it really could have gone either way, but I think God just took that moment of vulnerability. And so at the time I was teaching at George Fox, which is a Christian school, right? Right. And that was not an easy thing to be doing in this complete state of spiritual crisis, right? We're supposed to be spiritually forming our students. And I'm like, I can't even spiritually form myself. So, so I was like, oh, I'll just go work at a Catholic school. I got that in my head because I thought, yeah, Catholic schools, you don't have to like really be Christian to work at a Catholic school. But, I could still think about Christianity because I'm still interested in it, So I applied to a couple of Catholic places, and then I realized, maybe I shouldn't uproot my family because I'm having a crisis. But so I was sitting at my desk, and I just sent these emails withdrawing my application to these two Catholic schools. And then I just had this thought enter my head. And the thought was, you don't have to be at a Catholic university to be part of the Catholic Church. Okay. And again, this is not, I had not been going to mass. I had not been doing, like, this is crazy. But then in that moment, I just Googled the local Catholic parish, called them up, someone answered, which is also a miracle. And it happened to be the woman who runs this 70-year-old nun named Sister Juanita. And I was like, she's like, what do you want? I'm like, I don't know. I think I might be sort of interested in maybe talking about becoming Catholic, just all these hemming and hawing. And she was like, come to the church. So I did. I just went down there. And as soon as she asked me, like, why do you want to become Catholic? I would have expected myself to say, whoa there, lady. I not necessarily want to become Catholic. But instead I was like, the Eucharist, the saints. Like I just, all of a sudden, I think this longing that I had been pent up because I just had this like feminist wall. I had this like if you think about this like longing of my heart, that was like a river. It was like I had built this dam that was my kind of feminist ideology. And then as soon as there were just kind of these little cracks in the dam that had built over time. And then in that moment, it just broke through. But then the outcome was that I became Catholic while still having some of my feminist objections unresolved. So those would be namely related to sexuality and marriage. Like the gay marriage thing was real hard for me. That was the one that I just struggled with the most. And it took,
why? Just equality or fairness or?
Yeah. I mean, I think because I had been on from a progressive perspective for so long. I had gay students, loved my gay students. I had kind of mentored them and I had seen their struggle to find a place in the church. And it was one thing to say, okay, I'll accept the Catholic teaching on contraception. Like that's me taking a hit. If you look at it that way, I actually think it's great now. But at the time it was like, okay, well, this is a cross I'm taking on, right? Or, as a woman, or saying that, that's okay. I think only men can be priests. Like as a woman, those were hard to wrestle with. But then when it came to gay marriage, it was like me putting a cross on someone else.
Okay.
And that didn't feel good, right? Like it was one thing for me to accept a cross, what I then again saw as a cross, which again, now I don't.
Right.
Well, or I guess they're the good Christian kinds of crosses that come with perks like salvation, and sanctification. But that was the hardest one for me. And this was right when the Obergefell decision was being made. So it was also like just at this moment, like that the culture was like, yay. I was like, oh no, I'm starting to think differently. And anyway, so that the first couple years of being Catholic was really just me wrestling through all this stuff, reading a lot, praying a lot, sitting with it, kvetching to my husband, like confessing all my liberal sins. I joke that he was like this little agnostic priest that I would come and confess my liberal sins to him. Like, oh no, now I think I might think that like sexual complementarity is part of marriage. Like,
Was he raised Catholic or Catholic when you married him or no?
No. He grew up evangelical as well. Okay. And then he was more intellectually honest than I was. And he just became an atheist after college rather than doing this, like, I'm still a Christian, but with no real content to it. So anyway, but he's now kind of come full circle, sort of. He's on his own conversion path as we all are. But so he's now mostly Catholic, I would say.
Okay, mostly.
But, in his own way. Yeah, he's working through it. He's figuring things out. Yeah. He did join the church in 2020. Yeah.
Okay. How would you describe now? So that was a few years ago, and it's all part of a journey. You're still on a journey, I'm sure. How would you describe your now view from, as you understand how God created us, like how would you describe male and female relations with each other? I mean, for lack of better terms, would you consider yourself, like, to use an evangelical term, like complementarian, or do you have a more nuanced view of things? Or how do you read Ephesians 5 and women submit to your husbands or whatever? And
this is a good question. So I would say I hold to the idea of integral complementarity. So that's a Catholic understanding of complementarity that I would distinguish from evangelical complementarianism and also egalitarianism. So most forms of complementarianism that I encountered when I was an evangelical one, they're very hierarchical, even though they might say, sure, men and women have equal dignity. In practice, they often didn't. Like there really seemed to be the sense that men and women are so different, they're almost opposites. And that translates into very specific and restrictive roles for both men and women.
Okay.
Whereas I think in integral complementarity sees both men and women as whole persons, so fully human and sharing in the full range of human capacities, human virtue, human vocations.
Okay.
But then because of our sexual difference, our embodied difference, we live out our humanness differently in the world. And so there's a certain kind of wisdom or genius that men have access to and can cultivate because they are male, and women because we are female. And so there's a synergy that happens when men and women collaborate.
Huh.
But it's not like you have like half of a human and half of a human, and together they make a whole human, right? Which, even though if it's not explicitly stated, sometimes seems to be implicitly stated in a lot of more complementarian views, like, like men are assertive, women are submissive. They're kind of men are strong, women are docile. Like there's this almost polarity that like when men and women are like these cartoonish opposites, whereas integral complementary doesn't see men and women in that way, but rather sees that when they, instead of a half and a half coming together and making a whole, it's like you have a whole and a whole, and they come together and make something even more awesome just because they have a different way of being in the world that can inform the other.
So would you say in the Catholic Church it's less male hierarchical, even though you have male only priests and bishops and popes and all that stuff? I mean, would you say it feels different? It feels more, for lack of better terms, I don't know, equal or less hierarchical, or would that be not?
I mean, it's hard to say. So on the one hand, the Catholic Church has a very clear hierarchy.
Right,
so it's
right.
a hierarchical church, right? Like it has a visible hierarchy. You can
Right.
do the whole like apostolic succession thing, like it's very clear. But at the same time, I think one thing that's different between a Catholic and Protestant context is that the role of the priest is not necessarily coextensive with the role of a pastor or a teacher. So for example, you have the idea that women can't teach or preach is not a Catholic thing. Like, so women can teach and preach.
Oh, really?
We can't give the homily in the Mass because the Mass is having a specific liturgical function. So the Mass, the priest role is very much a sacramental one that's specific to the Mass. But when it comes to parish leadership, administrative leadership, teaching, preaching, I would say most parishes are female dominated. I don't mean dominated in a negative sense, but I would say that you see a lot of female catechists, you see a lot of female directors of religious ed, you see a lot of female theologians, teachers, speakers. I know just in my own experience too, like since becoming Catholic, like I'm asked all the time to teach and preach as a woman, or to even advise clergy on things. Right. So, or to serve on pastoral councils. So I think sometimes in a Protestant context, because you don't really have the priestly role as such anymore, you don't have this like sacramental function as much, the emphasis is much more on teaching and preaching. And so if you have this idea that only men can be priests, that usually gets expanded to only men can teach and only men can preach. And then that really kind of shrinks women's influence in the church as a whole. So
would you say, I mean, I'm trying to use the right words here, but like the priest doesn't have as much, or maybe the same kind of authority as like a typical evangelical, like mega church who maybe has like a CEO type leader who kind of founded the church and they kind of make the decisions, like that kind of authority, for good or for ill. I want to make a neutral evaluation of that, but like for an evangelical church that has a senior leader that has a lot of authority, would you say the priest typically does not have that same kind of authority over the church body in the same way?
Yeah, I would say so, because the priest himself is under authority, right? Like
Okay.
he's under the authority of the bishop, and the bishop is under the authority of the pope. So he's leading the parish,
Right.
in a sense, for sure. He's shepherding the parish is
Okay.
probably a better way to put it. He's the local shepherd, but he's not, like there's a way in which he is submissive to the church. Like he doesn't choose which readings we're going to read on Sunday, right? Like that's
sure,
that's every single Catholic in the entire world will have the same readings on the same, so there's this sense in which, the role of the priest is more subordinate to the church as a whole, right? He can decide what homily he wants to preach, but he doesn't choose the readings. He doesn't decide what order he wants mass to go in. Of course, priests, their personality comes through. That's for sure. It does. Like, and that's beautiful. But at the same time, you don't regularly have priests kind of, I think that the priest usually doesn't have as much power over what the parish looks like as a whole, because so much is just already kind of shared with the broader universal church.
Yeah. I do have to ask, it's just popped in my head, and maybe it's in light of the stuff that's come out with the SBC, with the abuse situation. Where are we at with the Catholic Church and all the abuse and allegations and all that? Like, not being Catholic, it's just such a distant thing. I just hear it, a blip on the news here and there. But is this a crisis that the church is going through? Are they doing a good job cleaning it up, or can you even speak into that? Or
I mean, that's a great question. So I think that a lot has improved especially since the scandal that broke. Is it the early 2000s? Maybe this was before I was Catholic, so I'm a little bit vague, in Boston.
Okay.
Because in response to that, a lot of things changed. A lot of norms changed. And so when the most recent wave of scandal broke, which I think was in 2018, and that was my first one to face as a Catholic, and that was tough. Tough.
Yeah.
But I think by the grace of God, I also happened to be that particular semester teaching a medieval seminar. And so we were reading, and I realized, like, oh my gosh, all my favorite medieval saints and writers, and they were all dealing with craziness in the church all the time. Like you read Dante's Inferno, and it's like there's popes in hell, man, because they had some really bad popes that were, and Hildegard of Bingen, I love her. She preached, and speaking of preaching, she went on preaching tours in the 12th century as a woman. And she's always writing. She was kind of a ball buster, but she was always writing these letters to like popes, like, get your shit together. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but because that was the investiture crisis, which was also a scandalous crisis of like, priests having concubines and getting married, and so that, I think that helped me realize, okay, there's like the church is bigger than just these like horrible, evil men who abuse their authority within the church and actually, honestly, like desecrate what the church teaches, you know what I mean? So like realizing that like, I can't walk away from the truth of the church because there are men who like abuse it. But that said, there has to be reform in earthly institutions all the time, because the human tendency to dominate, especially when it comes to sexuality, I mean, this is just like a perennial human evil. And anytime you have institutions that, I think people will use institutions to get access to people who are vulnerable. And if you don't have good policies in place and guardrails in place, then no matter what the institution is, whether it's a public school or a mega church or, a Catholic church. Anyway, so I do think this most recent wave in 2018, and this is not at all to dismiss it, but just to contextualize it, So the report that came out of the abuse that happened, it happened a while ago. So it's like stuff that's been covered up that happened a while ago is being exposed. But the stuff that's happening now, there just are a lot more, there's a lot more knowledge. There's a lot, laity are a lot more empowered. There's just a lot more protocols in place for making sure that power can't be abused in that way. But it's always something you have to be vigilant about, I think.
Okay.
Because I think especially if, I don't know, I mean, I don't want to sound like super Catholic here, but, I really do think that like if Satan is going to be attacking the church, like the best way to attack it is to try to bring it in, down from within. Like, and I think that, and that happens not just in the Catholic Church too, but I mean, I think that is such a good way to destroy or to push back against the church, because that rocks people's faith. People feel betrayed and devastated. And especially if you're sexually abused in a religious context, like how much that can harm just your relationship, your ability to connect with God. I mean, there's probably like nothing more evil than that kind of abuse from someone who's in a position of spiritual authority. I mean, it's just like, oh, and another thing in that semester, sorry, I'm like rambling. Another thing in that semester, we read the Gospel of Matthew, and Jesus talks so much about hell in the Gospel of Matthew. And guess who he sent into hell? Religious people in religious authority who are abusing their authority, and he's like, woe to you. Yeah. Especially that lead the young people astray. And so that was actually comforting to me, that I was like, yes, Jesus,
give them hell.
Preach it, Yeah. Like that kind of justice, like that there's some kind of eternal justice at work.
Yeah. The word Gehenna is used, I think 12 times in the Gospels and 11 times in Matthew and like once in Mark or something like that. Yeah. And it's always in the context. He never really preaches hell to non-people outside of religion, but those who are abusing religious authority, which is interesting as we think about what's the utility of the doctrine of hell. But I want to come back to your book. We kind of launched talking about your book, and then we got off on several rabbit trails, and that's totally my fault. When going back to, this is going to take a hard left turn, but so John Money, you kind of articulated his understanding of gender, and then you say at the beginning of the book you kind of trace that to today, and there's what's the difference now? How are people talking about gender now that is rooted in, that never would have happened apart from John Money, but is kind of different than how he's talking about it? Or is it different?
Yeah, it is different. So I guess one important piece of the puzzle is Judith Butler, right? Okay, so I think I mentioned this a little bit, but so Judith Butler is coming from a pretty radical postmodern perspective that I call anti-realist. So she's a hardcore social constructionist. Like I'm a soft social constructionist. Like absolutely our social norms and the words that we use, they do shape our perception of reality in a very real way. But reality still exists nonetheless. Right. So that's kind of my perspective. But Butler her whole project is an attempt to denaturalize everything. So like anything that's seen as natural or normal, she really is trying to sort of unmask that as ultimately about social power. Okay. And that includes gender and sex. So she's the first one to say that sex, the idea of maleness and femaleness, is just as much a social construct as gender is.
Just as much. She would, I mean, to say it is a social construct is wow, okay. But to say just as much is even more almost unbelievable. But.
Yeah, I think like here's like sort of a direct quote, if I can quote from memory, but she says, the word female has a meaning that is as troubled and unfixed as woman, right? So she's really saying that the way we see woman as a construct, we should see female the same way.
I've climbed inside of her head for about 5 minutes, and I can kind of see where she's going. At the same time, when I read Judy Butler, which isn't a lot, I don't wake up every day and do my devotions in Butler, but I've read a bit. It's not my field of study, okay? So I want to give her, the credit. She's obviously a brilliant person. But when I read her, there's times that I'm like, I don't think you know what you're talking about. But is that just me not being smart enough, but I've heard other people say, some people, like even Foucault and Butler especially, like, I think they're just saying stuff that it doesn't act like, if you ask them to kind of explain this paragraph, I don't think they even know what they're talking about. But is that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things. No, I've had this. I mean,
I've had whole paragraphs of it, and I've read it like 10 times, and like, this is written in English, but it that doesn't seem to make any sense at all.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the things that's dangerous about some of these high theory texts is that they're so intentionally obfuscating.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And sometimes I do think it's intentional because there's this self-conscious attempt to play with language and to push at the boundaries of language, right? And to kind of push at the boundaries of knowledge. So yes, I think that's actually one of the reasons why, not to sound too melodramatic, but some of these theories are dangerous, and why I've felt increasingly conflicted about teaching, say, Butler to undergraduates, because I would assign a text of Butler and I would see undergraduates, they would grab on, when you're reading a difficult text, you like grab on to like the two things you understand and you're like, yes, I understand that, and then they just run with it without realizing that, like, they love her idea of gender as a performance because they're like, oh yeah, I totally perform my gender all the time. Like I put on high heels and da-da-da. But then I'm like, no. She's saying it's only a performance. She's saying that the femininity that you're wanting to express doesn't exist. Like it doesn't exist.
Right.
Like there's no you. There's no like feminine you behind the performance. There's only the performing, right? And I think most people would find that less appealing. Would be like, oh, well, I like the idea of this, special inner me being expressed, right?
Right.
And that's what's interesting is that I think popular conceptions of gender and the way, say like, especially young people who have these kind of emerging gender identities, the way they talk about it is it doesn't really align with Butler, because they are, I think, often talking about it in more essentialist. Like there's my gender identity is this real thing that I need to express in this particular way through this label, through this, gender presentation. And so I think that's not the claim that Judith Butler is making. But the reason I think her work is important is because she kind of, I think, disrupted what we had sort of assumed and taken for granted about human beings. Like we had just assumed that sex is real. It's a thing, male and female. Like this is how human beings are organized. And then she just comes in and says like, nope, sex is a construct. And then that paves the way then for what I call gender identity theory, which is the idea that gender is that one's gender identity is based on subjective self-perception rather than the body. So I think that's kind of the common framework that we see now, which is different from what Money thought, because he thought that gender identity was more of an external form of socialization rather than something that's innate and within the human being, which seems to be what people say when they talk about their gender identity. Like it's something they sense within themselves. Yeah. That needs to be expressed.
Like it seems to come full circle back to you said the term that gender identity now is described in more essentialist terms without even using that term, which it seems like Butler would not at all agree with that, but she kind of paved the way for that. I mean, it's a weird.
Yes, she paved the way for that. I don't know what she actually thinks now, because she actually was critiqued by trans people because her whole idea of gender as only being a performance doesn't really map onto the gender identity theory. And so I think in her more recent work, she's been a little bit more like, she does a little more duck and roll with that question to be more trans friendly.
Well, again, I am in no way a Butler expert. I'm looking at my shelf here. What's her most famous book? The main one.
Well, there's Gender Trouble. Probably
between Gender Trouble and her more recent Undoing Gender, Gender Trouble, in my very naive vantage point, seems to very much undercut a lot of modern certain trans ideologies. I always use the plural because there's not one thing.
Right, exactly.
Trans, it seems to really undercut it, but it was written too long ago to where it wasn't a thing yet. Undoing Gender, her more recent book, I don't know, maybe it's 15, I don't know what the date was.
2004, I think.
Okay. I feel like she's is now this whole trans conversation is more aware, and she's trying to talk about gender in a way that doesn't undercut certain trans ideologies. And that's where I'm like, well, what you say here, you're saying you're agreeing before, but it sounds like you're not. But then again, she's so hard to follow sometimes. Like, you're just saying stuff, just throwing stuff out there. And I'm like,
right,
I don't know what you're saying,
Exactly. And a further complication is that the average undergrad who takes the gender studies course is going to read Gender as a Performance from Butler, right? So that's the things that get taught aren't necessarily the most recent things, which is why I think that, but there's so much incoherence, right? So here's something that I encounter. I don't know what your experience is, but especially when I am dialoguing with, young adults, like undergrad age, they'll say things like, I'll ask them like, what is gender? And they're kind of like deer in headlights all of a sudden, like, and they'll say things like gender's a construct or gender's a spectrum, but then they'll want to pivot and endorse again something like gender identity theory, which doesn't say that gender is a construct. Right? It says that gender is, again, this kind of innate
like an ontologically stable, innate part of humanity.
Right, exactly. Like it's
alongside sex, just as
it's like the inner you, right? Like the inner you knows your gender, whether or not whatever your body might say. Like you have this inner self that is gendered,
right?
And that's not a social construct, right? So it's very messy out there. Like it's hard to even map. Or they'll say gender is a spectrum, and I'm like, okay, do you mean gender is a spectrum, or do you mean sex is a spectrum? Right. Because those are two very different claims. And what do you mean by gender? Because sometimes they'll use the term gender, which almost sounds like it could be a synonym for like personality, right? Like, well, some people are like a little more feminine, some people like this, some people like that. And I'm like, well, yeah, if we're talking about, human personality, then of course it's a spectrum. There's a great range of, different kinds of variation. But if we're talking about male and female human beings, then, there are certain characteristics that you can talk about being on a spectrum, like height,
Right.
But then there are other things like gametes that are real hard binary, right? So it's difficult to talk about gender because it seems like there's so much incoherence where they want to say like gender is a social construct, but yet I also need to maybe have a double mastectomy in order to become my true gender. It's like, well, if it's a construct, then why do you need to have invasive surgery? That seems to be not entirely a coherent idea.
Right. Well, the whole gender as performance, is that in your most charitable understanding of Butler and those who would follow that, is that from my vantage point, it seems like it's that whole concept of gender as performance is propped up by gender stereotypes. Like, what does it mean to perform womanhood or perform womanness or whatever? Woman is what I'm performing. Okay, describe that to me. Could you describe that to me without falling back into stereotypes?
Right.
Is that fair, or am I missing something there? Like, how would she respond to that?
That's fair. And I think that's what she's saying. I think she's basically saying that we have these social scripts about this thing that woman is and this thing that man is, and that from the minute we enter the world, we're being indoctrinated and socialized into these social scripts.
Oh, okay.
But it's the scripts that create the illusion that a man or a woman exist. It's not something that's natural or intrinsic to human nature. So she would basically say the same thing. And so at least early Butler, like the performativity Butler, she kind of advocates for just basically the best you can do is just try to disrupt these norms, right? Like just play with them. She talks about drag as being this kind of parody that both shows the performativity of gender, but then also kind of undermines its, by self-consciously making it a performance. They're kind of subversively showing gender to simply be a performance. Right. So, but she's kind of pessimistic in the sense that she really sees social power as having so much determinism over human beings that you can only really be this perpetual gadfly. You know, you're kind of, you can just try queer in norms here and there, but you can never be totally free of them either.
Would she say sexuality is a construct as well? So there is the whole like born this way, essentialist kind of narrative. Would she have to, I mean, she probably wouldn't, would she disagree with that, or would her theories end up disagreeing with that without her actually saying, yeah, that's,
I think she would disagree with that.
Okay.
And I think really her whole project, and I swear in one of her early books, she's very explicit about this, but her entire philosophical project, at least it began with the goal to denaturalize the idea of heterosexuality.
Okay.
So to make room for non-heterosexual identities and to make those appear just as natural and normal, even though she's not going to say that anything's natural or normal. Like she even in Undoing Gender, you know, she writes against the incest taboo because, you know, she's trying to, that's the thing, right? If you denaturalize there are no sexual norms, right? Then, okay, what about incest, you know? And she goes there.
So she's kind of consistent. And I mean, she's not,
yeah,
she's very self-aware.
Gotta give her credit for consistency. Wow. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, she does the like suggestive, you know, I mean, that's what academics love to do. Like, I'm not actually making a claim. I'm just, you know, raising a question or gesture toward, you know, something like one might wonder whether the taboo of incest might, but who knows, you know, it's that kind of hand wavy sort of stuff.
Yeah. That's so funny.
Yeah.
I haven't gotten out of academia sort of, and like looking back, it is interesting, but well, thank you so much for being, I got another podcast coming up here in a second, but so the book is The Genesis of Gender, a Christian Theory. And I told you offline, I mean, it's selling really well. I mean, a lot of people are buying this book and reading it. It was just published July 11th, so just at the time of recording, just a couple weeks ago, or a week ago. It's been out for a week. Goodness.
That's crazy. Yeah.
Wow. That's wild. Well, thank you so much for the conversation, and I'm excited to actually dig into the book when I get a free second.
Yeah, let me know what you think. I'd love to hear what you think. Because I'm always willing to, you know, find out where I'm wrong and make adjustments. And anyway, but I'm always happy to talk to you. Yeah.
I think I'm going to find a lot of resonance with it. That's my guess. But
all right.
Yeah, thanks, Abigail.
Well, thanks so much. Bye.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.
Hey friends, I just want to invite you to consider joining the Theology in the Raw Patreon community. This is a group of followers who believe in the ministry and work of Theology in the Raw and want to support it financially. And honestly, I've been so impacted by the people who have chosen to support this podcast. Every month they send in a bunch of questions. A lot of them are really personal, and I get to spend time responding to them in a private podcast. And we, we'll message each other throughout the month and post responses to each other's questions. I'm actually going to start something new this fall, a monthly live Zoom chat with some of the members. And I'm super looking forward to actually seeing more of their faces every month. And there's other perks that come up, like, they all get a free virtual pass to the Theology in the Raw Exiles in Babylon conference every year. But honestly, I don't want to make it sound transactional. Every single Patreon member that I've talked to says the same thing. We like all the perks. We're thankful for them, but we're just more thankful to support the ministry of Theology in the Raw, and we're glad to do so. So if this is you, if you've been impacted by Theology in the Raw, you can join the Theology in the Raw community for a minimum of $5 a month by going to patreon.com/Theology in the Raw. That's patreon.com/Theology in the Raw. The link is in the show notes